How's it going, YouTube? Coming in today with another video, and today, guys, what the video is going to be an important guide to Crbr format, otherwise known as the crossover breaker format. It's been a lot of fun. I really do enjoy this format. I'm playing Riw Fiendsmith. The deck is kind of crazy. I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of crazy. I'm kind of nice with it. We'll talk about that today as well. If you haven't already checked out my sponsors over on Imperium Duelist, Dragonshield, Gem, Cloud, RW, Grimoire, definitely go ahead and do so, all down below in the description. And without further ado, let's hop right into the video. Before we do, make sure that if you are on TCG Player, you are using my link down below in the description. It costs nothing to you and only benefits the channel. I really do appreciate y'all, and let's talk about it. This is your format, realistically. But, you know, this is just kind of what we're seeing a lot of right now. Fiendsmith everywhere. I say it in like every video. Your format is Engraver, right? So this is pretty common for what we're seeing lately, but more specifically, what your format's going to be is starting off in the first spot here for first place all around. It's going to be the Riw Fiendsmith Kashtira deck. Now, this does look a little different than usual because I feel like this deck isn't just a Riw deck with a Fiendsmith engine in it. I feel like they're just as much a part of the deck together that they are as just an engine. And it's been a long time since we've seen a deck like this where both of the engines are both pretty main engines. I do like it a lot because there's a lot of lines where you can go for Requiem and summon Lacrima, and the Lacrima dump like Fiendsmith and Paradise, and then just summon an X out of hand, and then you have another 4 on board to go for Duo Drive. So definitely very cool. There's a lot of lines that really do work well together, and then you also have things like Chaos Angel that come up a lot. So I really do like this. It's the best deck in the game right now. 38% according to GGYGO Pro deck as far as the topping list versus any other deck. It was 40%, but there's a couple more lists that came out for different decks. So 38% of the tops right now in the game are coming from this deck, which is crazy because Malice is only at 18%. So definitely a very one-sided meta right now, but that does not mean that you cannot do well with these other decks here. And these are in order in terms of how I view the format. The second one is going to be Malice. You could say that the Striker build is a better build. I personally believe the Fiendsmith build is a better build. I think the Fiendsmith cards are like a necessity right now. Like, if you can play those cards, you should, right? Like, those cards are insane. But I understand a lot of validity to playing the Engage package. That's something where you can still get away with playing things like Shifter, whereas if you're playing the Fiendsmith cards, you cannot. So definitely understandable, but Malice is still the second best deck in the game right now, so keep that in the back of your mind. It's also the more expensive deck. I know that if you're talking about like a pure Riw deck, pure Riw is less expensive, but the Fiendsmith package is just going to be $400 no matter what you swing it at, right? Like, the deck's expensive. Now, for the third one here, it's going to be the pure Fiendsmith deck. There is a small Kashtira engine, but I don't really even consider that like a part of the name for this one. Like, it's just there, but it's mostly just like the pure Fiendsmith deck. Deck's really crazy. Deck has a lot of grind game, a lot of hand traps. So that's one thing where I think the deck still does pretty well. It's definitely fallen off a bit now, and it might go down below something like Tenpai, but it's still really strong. I'm not a huge fan of playing a deck like that. It's not my favorite. I'd rather just play the first deck here because that deck's insane, and we'll talk about more of that later. But the next deck here is Tenpai. The deck never really fell off. The deck's still doing phenomenal. It's still in the top 5 decks in the game right now, which is crazy. And then Yubel. Yubel really fell off, but if I had to pick a 5th deck here, it has to be Yubel because it's another deck that just utilizes the Fiendsmith engine the best, right? So we definitely have a lot of decks here that can use the Fiendsmith engine. We've even seen Tenpai with the Fiendsmith engine, the Kashtira cards. So there's a lot of different variations that you could run here. I really do like Yubel, though, as far as a sleeper pick in the format, because a lot of people can forget about it. One Phantom of Yubel mixing is really awkward, though. I've played against the deck already, and it definitely becomes weird, because sometimes you use a Phantom as, like, an additional body, and when you don't have that, it's like, well, that sucks, you know, so definitely a little different. And then the 6th place here is going to be Memento. You could play it pure, you could play it Fiendsmith. It doesn't really matter which one you do. I think the deck has a lot of validity. It's still one thing where it's like less good than the other options, and you kind of have to be insane with the deck to do well in a format like this. So if you want to play Memento, you might still be scraping the X2 barrel, right? But at the same time, you could go like X3. I don't know. It's really complicated to play that deck perfectly and optimally. So that's one thing where I think if somebody really puts the theory into their deck list and their tech options, they could do pretty well. I know a lot of people are still kind of like, this is the plant deck of Europe, where they're not really reading the cards and people are still losing to Memento, where Memento is pretty straightforward in my opinion, especially if you play against it enough. You'll kind of learn where those choke points are, and we'll talk about that in the next Where to Hand Trap. But moving on to the next slide here, versus the format, couple things that I want to note. I do really like Ultimate Slayer. You could play a Kaiju if you want to. I think removing the terahertz is really fire because you don't have to deal with Pack Bit and you don't have to deal with the Save Worm. So that's definitely a plus there if you want to deal with that. Just to go ahead and get that away from the Malice board, because the Malice board isn't really that threatening outside of like a Banish 3 from like a White Binder and some hand traps. They could have like a trap card like an MTP they get to after they summon back the White Rabbit set MTP, and they're able to use that as just non-targeting banish and get follow-up, which is cool. But you can also just Ash MTP, which is fantastic. So that's another thing where if you like top deck Ash, it's not even that bad of a 6 card right now because you can hit Paradise with it. So that's one thing too, where it's like Ash is mandatory, Ultimate Slayer, in my opinion, and the side deck's mandatory, and we'll talk about what else is mandatory coming up here. But making it a point to just get rid of either of these off the board immediately is very strong. The Fiendsmith variant, which is the more popular variant of Riw, does not play plugin, so the second you get rid of the detonator, it's usually gone, and that's one thing that you want to keep considering. The Baguska lock's still really real, so they'll go like Baguska cross detonator, and that's really strong. You just need to make sure that you have an out for it. Whatever deck you're playing right now, if you can fit in a Cashier package, you should. You absolutely should. 100% play 1 Unicorn, play 2 Unicorn, play Unicorn, a Fenrir, a Raid Saw, a Terraforming, and a Birth. You want to really make sure that you have this card in your deck, because in the Fiendsmith variant, Duo Drive's a one of. It's a one of. Hitting that is brutal. You're always hitting Requiem first for the most part, but hitting Duo Drive is really nice. If you see them going for like a specific line, you could just hit the Duo Drive. But hitting Requiem is definitely always brutal, because that's going to be the biggest thing for the deck to bridge. It's the best way to get back to your Lacrima summon to dump the Paradise. And then you also can hit the White Binder, which is like the biggest payoff for Malice. So there's a lot of different options here. It's also really nice because if you start Unicorn and then you summon something your opponent has to interact with, then they just play into the Unicorn, and then if Unicorn survives till their turn, which a lot of times you'll search Birth and hold it for as long as you need to, and then you'll just activate Birth, summon Unicorn. The second they make an action, you're just like Unicorn effect, rip the other card. And it makes things really awkward when you don't have things to go into, especially when they're like your starter plays. So these are things to think about that can really slow your opponent down without really having to do too much. And I think that's one thing where people kind of overcomplicate formats and like, well, what do I do to these huge decks? You know, it's like, well, you could just summon a Unicorn. It makes things really easy. So that's one thing to think about. The next thing here is that if your opponent summons Engraver and Necroequip, they're going to put both the 6s on the board. And they're going to look at you and they're going to say, is the summon of either of these fine? And if you say, yeah, that's cool, a lot of times your opponent is just like, all right, cool. My opponent doesn't have rock because they would rock me here in case I'm about to summon Wave King. So since they're not hitting me with rock here, I'm just going to go Desiree line. And that's one thing where you kind of have to keep that in mind, where your opponent, when they summon both of these, they could just bluff that they're going to put up a Wave King. And if you're just like, nah, it's cool, sometimes you'll really catch them off guard. Even if you have rock, and then you're like, no, that's cool, and then they summon Desiree, and you just hit them with rock. It's risky because you don't know if they're actually just going to go for like a Wave King. A lot of times, if your opponent only opens up the Fiendsmith cards, especially game 1, they're just going to be summoning Wave King and passing. They're not even going to go for like a Desiree line, usually. So that's one thing where this is kind of a mind game right now, where if they summon both of these and they're like, is this okay? You can either just absolutely metagame them and then let them make the Desiree after that, or you stare at your rock in your hand and they make Wave King. It's a judgment call. You got to make the right one in the moment, but this is something that you got to look for in the format. Paradise is probably the most annoying card right now. Honestly, it really is, but it has so many outs, so it shouldn't be that bad. You can Bishop the Requiem when they try to Lacrima bring it back. You can Crow the Requiem. You can Ash the Paradise. You can Bell the effect of Lacrima. So there's a lot of ways that you can go ahead and just stop this from being a problem. This card does banish for cost as well, so once it's gone, it's gone. It's a one-off. And usually this card doesn't really get sided out. Sometimes people do. I typically do. I don't really like it in my deck going second. I don't want to hard draw it. It would really suck to have a brick going into a board. You want to have all your cards live as much as possible. Thrust, Ultimate Slayer, your Kaijus if you're playing anything that you want, I really do think that you should be putting those in over this. I've heard a lot of people say that you don't cut the Paradise no matter what, but I'm not drawing a trap card going second. Mandatory 3 of at all times right now. I really do believe in this, and obviously things change and nothing's ever correct in Yu-Gi-Oh, but like right now, these are mandatory 3 ofs that need to be in your deck list. 3 Lancia, 3 Ultimate Slayer on your side. In your main deck, 3 Ash, 3 Nib, 3 Talent. Like, these just have to be there. And that's one thing where none of these are expensive, and they're going to give you the best odds of just beating your opponent outright. Lancia against Memento, Lancia against Malice, Lancia against Ritual Beast if you run into it, like, Lancia against any kind of a Runic deck if you run into it. Like, Lancia, it does really well. Obviously, it's going to be for, like, the Malice deck mostly, but it's really good against Memento. Shots to Tyler. That was a big thing on stream the other day, but that was really cool. That was really good. But overall, that's one thing where you really have to focus on what cards are mandatory in the format and really make sure that you include those in your deck list. And if you're playing a deck that can't play these cards, maybe consider playing a different deck. Recommended cards, things that are not mandatory, but you should consider playing them because I think that they're all very good. One thing is going to be Bestials. You should be on these. I wanted to throw this in mandatory, but it's recommended. You should be on Bestials. Droll, Bell hits a lot right now. Droll is like okay against certain situations, but like really strong against others. It's one thing where I think that a lot of people are not playing Droll, and the people that are getting away with a couple wins just because Droll resolves, and it can make things really awkward. Book of Eclipse, really good answer to a full board, unless your opponent has Ash, then it just turns on your Talent and your Thrust, and then you win the game anyway. Thrust, this is a card that you should be playing in tandem with your Talent already. I think that Thrust is so good, especially with things like Ultimate Slayer. And then Duster. I think Duster and Lightning Storm are really strong right now, especially Duster. That's a card that you really should be on. Duster answers things like Cross, it answers things like Plugin. It's really solid just because you can go ahead and just like clear things, you can force things out, even against Malice. A lot of Solemn Strikes being in the back row right now. A lot of Solemn Strikes. So making sure that you have something like a Duster to go ahead and just clear the board real fast before you start committing to the board, really important. Now, this format, specifically this format, Cope. These are all Cope. Impulse isn't that good. It's pretty good against Malice with the banished effects, but like otherwise, it's pretty lackluster. I'm not a huge fan of this, especially because if you're playing this, you can't play things like Cashier or Unicorn, and I don't love that. It also stops Earth monsters, so, you know, no Fenrir. You can't Nib unless you set it, and Nib is so good right now. I think that Impulse and Purge, I don't like Purge at all, first and foremost. I really don't. Unless you're playing like Melodious and you want to run Purge, then sure. But like Impulse right now in particular is just really bad because like if you're maining Impulse and not maining Nib, I feel like you're putting yourself inherently behind. Nib is just too crazy, right? Like I'd rather not stop one specific summon and just like nib them. And that's really important. I think Reaper is really bad. That was one thing that a lot of people tried out. Lava Golem, Crossout, Metatronus. I think all these are just like really lackluster, should not be in your deck list. I know a lot of people like Metatronus right now. I don't. I think this card is just really bad. It's another thing that's just like targeting, so if you're playing against like a Desiree or something, like this doesn't really matter. If you're playing against like a Detonator, like sure you can clear it, but I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of Metatronus. Maybe I can be proved wrong on this, but I don't think that card's very good. To conclude today's video, I want to show you guys my personal list right now for Ryzel Fiendsmith Cash. I do like this deck a lot. I think that it's really consistent. It has a lot of ways that you can play through a lot of different boards. I do play the one Fenrir, one Birth, one Unicorn, one Rate Saw. I do not play the Terraforming. You don't really need that. But at the same time, I play the 3 Engraver and 1 Tract. People play more Tract. I don't think that's necessarily correct. You can always go Engraver for like Paradise too, and then go like Ice Pitch Paradise. So that's been nice as well. I've done that quite a few times. I really do like the deck overall. I think that it really does well. In this side, I was playing 2 Sanctum. I ended up cutting a Sanctum for a Dweller. That was something we found out yesterday on stream that it was just like really necessary to have, so we kept it in the side. The extra deck's really tight. A lot of people don't play the Moon right now. They just play the Exciton, but I think that the Moon is too important. There's been a lot of situations where I'll go like a hand trap and like Unicorn into Moon and then keep playing the game. So that's one thing where I think that you kind of need the Moon. You don't necessarily need the Moon. I did cut a gum day. Again, extra deck's just too tight. There's not enough room. There's literally no room that I could find at all for it. But overall, thrust in the side with the 1 Sanctum or the 1 D-Barrier I think is really strong. But going second, those with Duster and like Ulti Slayer is really strong too. I really do hope that you enjoyed today's video. I hope that you learned something. If you are going to use the list, let me know how it feels. Let me know if there's anything that you would change. And I hope that you all have a wonderful night. I'll catch you on the next video. Thank you.